They all laughed when I stood up in that courtroom. The judge raised his brow. The bailiff frowned. The lawyers chuckled like I was the entertainment for the day. Just a maid. Just a black woman with an apron and a quiet voice. But I wasn't laughing, because the man I had worked for, the one who paid me fairly, who never once called me girl like the others, had just been abandoned. His lawyer vanished when the stakes got real, left him standing there alone. They thought that was the end of it. But I stood. I walked to the front of that courtroom, and I said 5 words I didn't even know I had the courage to speak. Your Honor, I'll defend him. I wasn't a lawyer. I wasn't rich. But I was the only one left willing to tell the truth. And if you think that stopped the courtroom from laughing, you should have seen what happened next. Before I tell you, hit subscribe if you believe ordinary people can do extraordinary things. And drop a comment. Tell me where in the world you're watching from. Let's remind them that dignity has no job title. People assume a maid's job is to be invisible. Clean the mess, close your mouth, and pretend you never heard the things that would ruin powerful men if they ever got out. For 9 years, I worked in Richard Alden's house, a man Fortune magazine once called America's cleanest billionaire. I polished his glass tables, scrubbed his imported tile floors, and kept his secrets locked tighter than the wine cellar. But he was different from the others. When his board members looked through me, he looked at me. When his guests handed me their coats without saying a word, he said, "Thank you, Marlene." He even learned the name of my son, Jamal. Sent a card when Jamal was hospitalized. Slipped a check in when the insurance refused to cover the surgery. No cameras, no noise, just decency. Still, I never expected to be anything more than the help. Until I noticed the tension in his hands that Monday morning. He sat at the dining table untouched, staring at a piece of paper like it held his future in its teeth. "Everything all right, Mr. Alden?" I asked, keeping my tone light. He looked up slowly. "They're trying to bury me." That's when I saw the subpoena. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Richard had enemies, sure, boardroom snakes with Ivy League smiles. But embezzlement? Corporate theft? It didn't add up. He was meticulous, careful, paranoid about integrity. The kind of man who reviewed tax reports himself even with 1,000 accountants on payroll. I didn't press. I knew my place. But that day, as I wiped crumbs from a plate he hadn't touched, I saw him make a call. He spoke in hushed tones to his lawyer, a slick white man named Jefferson Crane. A man I never liked. Something in his voice always reminded me of cheap suits and fast exits. That evening I passed by the study. The door wasn't shut all the way. I heard Crane's voice, low, tense. "This case is going to be a mess," he said. "Your reputation's done, Richard. You're on your own if it gets worse." And Richard? He didn't fight back. He just sighed. I should have walked away, but something in my gut told me, the people who wear the fanciest suits are the first to disappear when the floor starts crumbling. And the people they step on? We're the ones left sweeping up the mess. Again. I didn't know it yet, but that conversation would follow me all the way into a courtroom. A courtroom I never imagined I'd speak in, let alone be heard. By Friday, the house felt colder, not from the weather, but from the weight of something closing in. Richard barely left his office. His calls were short, his voice clipped. He wasn't sleeping either. I could tell by the way the espresso machine was running at 3 a.m., and by the stack of untouched food trays I had to clear in the morning. Then came the boxes, files, binders, folders with tabs and legal stamps. He told me, "Don't touch these, Marlene. Just keep them close." I didn't ask questions. I'd learned years ago that silence kept me safe, but my eyes weren't blind. One file had a sticky note on it that Crane, final draft. I stared at that name, Jefferson Crane. That man had the same grin every time he entered the house, the kind that looked polished on the outside but hollow in the eyes. Richard trusted him. That much I knew. But after overhearing that phone call, my spirit told me otherwise. I began to pay attention. I noted the names I heard whispered during late calls. Ferguson, Langston, Munro, all board members. All men who used to come to this house smiling with their wives on Richard's birthday. Now, they were plotting behind his back. I could hear the tone in their voices, the way they talked about him like a liability. Not a friend, not a leader, just a falling giant. One afternoon, as I dusted near the den, I heard Crane say to someone on speakerphone, "If we're lucky, the judge won't delay it. He'll walk in unrepresented and fall flat." I froze. Unrepresented? Was he planning to ditch Richard in court? I felt the dust cloth slip from my hands. Everything in me wanted to march in and warn Richard, but I couldn't prove what I'd heard. Worse, if I got caught listening, I could lose the only job keeping a roof over Jamal's head. I stayed silent, but I started writing things down. Names, dates, little things, Richard said in passing. "They're pushing the hearing up," or "Crane says he needs more time." No. Crane wasn't buying time. He was stalling, and Richard, too proud to admit he was being set up, was walking right into the fire. The night before the trial, I found Richard staring at a framed photo of his late wife. His voice cracked when he said, "She always said I had too much faith in people." Then he handed me a small leather binder, no label, just my name on a note. "Marlene, only if it gets ugly." I took it. I didn't ask, but I felt the blood drain from my face, because deep down I knew it was already ugly, and tomorrow it would be public. The courthouse was colder than I expected, not just the air but the stairs. I sat on the back bench in my church clothes, modest skirt, clean blouse, the same shoes I wore when I buried my mama. I didn't belong there, not to them. You could see it in their eyes. Whispers floated through the room like perfume. "He's really bringing the maid? He has no one else left? Where's his high-priced lawyer now?" I waited for Jefferson Crane to strut through those courtroom doors, briefcase in hand, fake confidence on his face. But the doors opened, and it was only Richard. Alone. No lawyer. No allies. Just him. Pale, tired, and walking like he was carrying the weight of every lie told about him. The judge adjusted his glasses. "Mr. Alden, where is your representation?" Richard cleared his throat. "He withdrew this morning, Your Honor, unexpectedly." The judge didn't hide his annoyance. "This is a felony hearing. You understand the gravity of what you're facing?" "I do." Snickers echoed from the opposing side. His former board members, now plaintiffs, sat smug like wolves watching a deer limp into open ground. I felt my stomach tighten. This wasn't a hearing. It was a slaughter, and I was just a maid. But then Richard did something I didn't expect. As the prosecution began laying out their accusations, he turned around. His eyes searched the room until they landed on mine. Not a word, just a look, a silent please. I'd seen that look once before, when my boy Jamal was in the ER and I didn't know if he'd make it through the night. When I begged the doctors to try just one more treatment. That quiet, desperate faith, the kind you can't fake. The judge called for a recess. 15 minutes. That was all it took for me to make the decision that would change both our lives. When the court resumed, the judge repeated, "Mr. Alden, without representation, I'll have to delay." I stood up. The room turned toward me like I'd thrown a chair. "Your Honor," I said, my voice shaking but steady. "May I speak?" The judge blinked. "And you are?" "Marlene Jenkins. I've worked for Mr. Alden for nearly a decade. I'm not a lawyer, but I have information that could help this case, and I'm willing to speak under oath." Laughter broke out behind me. One of the prosecutors smirked. "She's the maid, Your Honor. This is outrageous." But the judge, he didn't dismiss me. Not yet. He looked down at his notes, then at Richard, then at me. "Maid or not," he said slowly, "if you have knowledge relevant to this case, the court is obligated to listen." And just like that, the courtroom went quiet. Because no one saw it coming, not even me. I had never stood in front of a courtroom before. My legs felt like broomsticks. My hands were shaking, but I clasped them behind my back like I did when waiting for a guest to finish dinner. The judge studied me. "You do understand the seriousness of what you're about to say, Ms. Jenkins?" "Yes, Your Honor," I replied. "And I understand perjury. I have nothing to gain from this except the truth." He nodded, then gestured to the bailiff. "Swear her in." The prosecution's lead attorney, Mr. Langston, one of Richard's ex-board members, leaned toward the judge. "This is highly irregular. She has no legal qualifications, no formal standing." The judge cut him off. "She may not be counsel, but she claims to have relevant first-hand knowledge. Let's hear her." The courtroom murmured again. I took a deep breath and walked to the witness stand. As I sat down, I locked eyes with Richard. He didn't smile, he didn't nod, but I saw it. The quiet hope. The kind of hope you only feel when everyone else has given up on you. I started with the facts. I was present on multiple occasions when members of Mr. Alden's board visited the house privately. I served drinks, I cleaned up after meetings. I wasn't supposed to listen, but I heard enough. I mentioned Ferguson, Monroe, Langston. I recited dates, conversations I overheard, deals I suspected were being pushed through behind Richard's back. They tried to object. They failed. Because I had something none of them thought I'd have. Memory. I remembered Langston's voice the night he told Richard, "This will blow over if you play along." I remembered the whisper of envelopes slid across marble counters, the thank yous exchanged in the shadows, and I had more than memory. I reached into my purse and held up the leather binder Richard gave me. "Mr. Alden instructed me to hold on to this in case something ever happened," I told the court. He said, "If it gets ugly, Marlene, give them the truth." Inside were emails, handwritten memos, a personal journal entry outlining the threats Richard received. The judge allowed me to read one line aloud. "They want to bury me quietly. I won't go down silent, and neither should she." She, I realized, meant me. The courtroom wasn't laughing anymore. The same people who once handed me their coats like I was part of the furniture were now watching me, mouths closed, faces pale. I wasn't just a maid anymore. I was a problem, a black woman in a courtroom daring to speak without a title, without permission, and worse, being heard. And I hadn't even gotten to the worst of it yet. They tried to knock me down, of course. Not with fists, but with smirks, with language wrapped in suits and smugness. Langston stood up, clearing his throat as though preparing to educate a child. "Miss Jenkins," he said, dragging the syllables like a drawl, "can you remind the court of your professional background?" I sat up straighter. "I've been a housemaid for over 20 years, sir. First in Louisiana, then in New York. 9 of those years under Mr. Alden." The courtroom shifted. Langston smiled without warmth. "So, no legal training, no business degree, no formal education in financial law?" "No, sir, but I do have ears and eyes, and I know how to listen to what folks say when they think you don't count." That shut him up for a beat. Then came the next blow. "So you're testifying under oath based on overheard conversations, hearsay? And how do we know you're not lying to protect your employer? After all, your salary depends on him." I wanted to laugh. "Salary? Sir," I replied, "my salary barely covers my boy's asthma medication. If money was my goal, I'd be sitting on the other side of this courtroom, like you." Gasps. The judge banged his gavel once. "Order." Langston's tone hardened. "You're out of your depth, Miss Jenkins." I looked him dead in the eye. "You said that same thing about me 2 years ago. I was serving canapes at a fundraiser. You asked me to throw away a draft letter you wrote to investors. But it had Richard's name forged at the bottom." His eyes twitched. "Yes, I remembered. I remember everything. Because when you're black and invisible, you have to. One mistake and you're not just fired, you're erased." I pulled out that letter. I'd kept it. Not out of spite, but because something about it had felt wrong. The date, the signature, the tone. Now, it was evidence. The judge took the copy, read it silently, then looked at Langston with narrowed eyes. "This letter alone warrants further investigation," he said coldly. Langston backed off, his face now flushed. He didn't smile again. I wasn't a trained witness. I didn't know legal lingo. But I knew these men. I'd watched them sip whiskey in my kitchen and plan takeovers with sugar on their tongues and steel in their hearts. They spoke carelessly around me like I wasn't even there. And now? Every word they ever threw around me like trash was crawling back into that courtroom. Truth doesn't always come from degrees and PowerPoints. Sometimes it comes from a woman in a plain blouse who's been cleaning up after men like them for too long. And for the first time, they were the ones being swept into the light. After my testimony, the air in that courtroom changed. The laughter had stopped, the smirks faded, but the danger hadn't passed. Because when you're a black woman speaking too boldly in the wrong room, they don't need to shout. They know how to cut you quietly, with glances, with questions that coil like snakes. During the break, one of Langston's associates approached the bench to clarify my credibility. "She's emotional, Your Honor. She's not used to environments like this. She may have misunderstood. That was code, not used to environments like this. What they meant was, she doesn't belong here." Back on the stand, they started playing games with language. "Miss Jenkins, have you ever been disciplined or dismissed from employment before?" "No, sir." Are you currently in any financial hardship? I blinked. I'm a maid in Manhattan raising a son alone. Define hardship. Laughter stirred again, but this time it was uneasy. Langston leaned in. Have you ever received government assistance, Miss Jenkins? I stared at him. I knew what he was doing, painting me as desperate, untrustworthy, a stereotype dressed up and paraded for the court. I answered anyway. I have. Once, when Jamal was diagnosed, I worked double shifts, sold my car, and took the subway until his lungs got stronger. No shame in survival. They hated that I didn't flinch. But the worst came next. Langston stepped back and said, "Let the record reflect that Miss Jenkins has no formal education, has relied on government aid, and was not invited to testify by legal counsel." The judge didn't object. He simply nodded and said, "The record will reflect the facts, all of them." And then, just for a moment, his eyes met mine. And I swear they softened. They softened. Because facts cut both ways. They thought I'd crumble under the weight of their words. But they didn't know I came from women who'd been called worse and still walked with their heads high. My grandmother once cleaned courthouse floors in Alabama. She told me, "They'll use their titles to make you feel small. But baby, truth doesn't need a degree." I held that in my chest like a shield. They kept pressing, but the fire was gone from their eyes. Because no matter how many times they tried to drag me back into silence, I kept standing. And when court adjourned that day, the reporters didn't rush the lawyers. They rushed me. Flashing lights, mics in my face. "Miss Jenkins, how does it feel to be the center of $1 billion defense?" I didn't answer. Because this wasn't about fame. It wasn't about money. It was about what I'd heard, what I'd seen, and the man I refused to let fall because of cowards in tailored suits. And tomorrow, I'd be back, with the binder and the truth. The next morning, I didn't wear fear. I wore purpose. I walked into that courtroom with the same leather binder Richard had handed me a week before. The one with no label, no logo, just quiet weight in my hands. People stared again, but different this time. Not with smirks, but with confusion. Caution, like they weren't sure who I was anymore. Langston and his crew avoided eye contact. The judge asked if I wished to submit any further material. I nodded and held up the binder. This belonged to Mr. Alden. He gave it to me with instructions to provide it only if the situation became dangerous. The judge raised a brow. "And would you say that threshold has been met?" I didn't blink. "Yes, sir." The clerk took the binder and passed it to the judge, who flipped through the pages. Then his reading slowed. His face changed. Inside were time-stamped email threads, scanned copies of internal memos, and even handwritten notes from Richard outlining board-level manipulations. There were screenshots of transactions approved without his signature, including one to an offshore account linked directly to Langston's private firm. Langston stood. "Objection. This material is unverified." "Sit down," the judge snapped, for the first time raising his voice. "You'll get your turn. Right now, this witness has just shifted the weight of this entire case." Gasps spread across the room. But I wasn't done. "There's also a journal entry," I said, lifting a small folded note. "It's in Richard's handwriting, dated 2 months before this trial." The judge nodded. "Please read it aloud." I unfolded the page and read, "They're trying to use my silence as a weapon. They think if they isolate me, I'll fold. But I've left enough behind to expose them. If I can't speak for myself, Marlene will." You could hear a pin drop. The same courtroom that mocked me 3 days ago was frozen. Langston turned pale. One of the junior lawyers leaned over and whispered something in his ear. He shook his head like a man watching his foundation collapse. The judge leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen. "We'll take a recess," he said quietly. "When we return, the prosecution will address this new evidence. And if any part of it proves true, we'll be looking at a very different trial." I stepped off the stand, legs shaking but still moving, and as I passed Langston, he looked up at me, not with superiority, but with fear. Because for the first time, he wasn't facing a maid. He was facing a witness, and I was only getting started. When court resumed after recess, the energy had shifted like a storm rolling in. Gone were the jokes and whispers. Even the security guards straightened their posture. The press gallery leaned forward, pens frozen in hand. Langston tried to reframe everything, of course. He called the documents unauthenticated, claimed Richard had orchestrated a smear campaign. But the more he spoke, the more desperate he sounded. The judge interrupted him halfway through. "Mr. Langston, your name appears in 3 separate financial memos and a 4th offshore transfer authorized under your login credentials. You may want to consider counsel of your own." Langston sat down. For the first time since this trial began, he looked small. Richard hadn't said a word during my testimony, but now he turned to me and whispered, "You didn't have to do this." I answered softly, "You never made me feel like I was less. You saw me. That's why I had to." I didn't care that I was just the help. I had sat at too many dinner tables where billionaires laughed about who they were going to throw under the bus next. I'd refilled wine glasses for men who called my son one of the good ones because he got a scholarship. I'd heard it all. They thought the courtroom belonged to them, that justice bent toward power. But today, the truth had walked in wearing old shoes and a discount blouse, and none of their suits could stop it. The judge asked if I had anything else to say. I hesitated. Then I stood. "Your Honor, may I speak freely, not as a witness, but as a human being?" He gave a single nod. I turned to face the court. "My name is Marlene Jenkins. I raised a boy while cleaning up after men who think money makes them untouchable. I watched my people locked out of rooms, dismissed, erased. But I also watched a man who owns everything treat me like I mattered. Not because of my uniform, but in spite of it. What happened in this case isn't just business. It's not just about fraud or money. It's about power. And how men like Mr. Langston think they can crush others, quietly, as long as nobody's watching." I paused. "Let it hang there. Today somebody watched." The room was silent. The judge cleared his throat. "This court acknowledges Ms. Jenkins' statement. We will recess for deliberation and resume with a ruling." As I stepped down, the gallery erupted into whispers. Cameras clicked. Reporters ran out to call their stations. "And Richard?" He finally smiled. Not because he'd won, but because I'd made them see. The following morning, the courthouse was full before the doors even opened. Reporters lined the steps, cameras rolled, and for once they weren't there for the billionaire. They were there for the maid. I kept my head low as I walked in, but people still whispered my name, like I was someone new. A headline, a symbol. I wasn't used to that. Richard sat tall at the defendant's table, calm, quiet, but I could see it in his hands. The tension, the weight of waiting to be erased or redeemed. When the judge entered, the room held its breath. He adjusted his glasses, shuffled his papers, then looked over the rim of the bench. "This court has reviewed the submitted evidence, testimony, and financial records. Based on what has come to light, key charges against Mr. Richard Alden are hereby dismissed." Gasps. A woman behind me clapped, then stopped herself. The judge continued, his voice hardening. "In addition, the court is referring Mr. Langston and 2 named board members to the State Bar and District Attorney's Office for potential fraud, perjury, and obstruction of justice." Langston's jaw dropped. He looked like a man watching his empire crack tile by tile. Richard exhaled, just once. The judge banged the gavel. "This court is adjourned." It was done. Reporters swarmed the hallway like bees, but I kept moving. I wasn't interested in interviews. I didn't need applause. I just needed air. Outside, Richard caught up with me. "You saved me," he said. "You could have walked away." I shook my head. "You didn't treat me like the help. Not once in 9 years. That's rare where I come from." He reached for something in his coat pocket, a check. I stopped him. "Don't." "Marlene, you earned this, 10 times over. I didn't do this for money. I did this so my son could see what dignity looks like in a system that was never built for us." He swallowed hard and put the check away. Then he said something that surprised me. "If you ever want to work in advocacy, law, policy, whatever, I'll back you." I nodded but didn't answer, because I already knew what came next. I had a fire inside me now, and I wasn't going back to sweeping floors for men who lied behind boardroom doors. As I walked down those courthouse steps, I felt something shift. Not in the system, not yet. That would take time, but in me. For once, I wasn't surviving, I was leading. It's been 6 months since that courtroom fell silent, since a black maid in discount shoes shook a billion-dollar empire, not with power, not with prestige, but with memory, with courage, and with truth. I no longer work in Richard Alden's home. Not because I was fired, but because I chose to leave. I now lead a small nonprofit called the Stand Project. We help women, especially women of color, navigate the legal system when they're ignored, dismissed, or silenced. Some come in broken, others come in angry. All of them come in invisible. I sit with them. I listen. I show them that they're not alone. And sometimes I hand them a binder of their own. Richard kept his promise. He funded the launch quietly, with no press, no spotlight. This time, he told me, your name goes on the door. Funny thing is, for a man who once owned a tech empire, he told me the most valuable thing he ever built was a second chance. But truthfully, it was never his to build. It was mine. I didn't go to law school. I didn't wear pearls. I didn't speak like the attorneys on TV, but I told the truth. And when the system tried to laugh me out of the room, I stayed standing. Because my grandmother cleaned floors in courthouses where she wasn't allowed to sit. Because my mother worked kitchens in firms that never learned her name. Because I had a son watching, and I needed him to see what power looks like when it doesn't wear a suit. Let me tell you something I've learned. Justice doesn't ask for credentials, it asks for courage. And sometimes the loudest voice in the courtroom comes from the quietest person in the room. So if they ever tell you you're too small, too poor, too unimportant to speak, stand anyway. Because truth doesn't need a title. It just needs someone willing to carry it into the light. If this story moved you, if you believe everyday people can shake the walls of injustice, do something simple but powerful. Hit that subscribe button to join Echoes of Hope Stories HQ, where real voices get heard. Comment below and tell us where you're watching from, your city, your country, your corner of this world. We want to hear your voice too. And share this story, not for me, but for the next woman like me. Still sitting in the back, still thinking she doesn't matter. Because one day, she might just stand up and silence a courtroom.